We are recording this in mid-November 2019 so as to announce the publication of my new book, which focuses on the depoliticization of Greece's public revenue administration. It's a book that was published a few days ago by Springer, and one that I co-authored with my colleague Argyris Passas from Panteion University of Social Sciences in Athens. The research that we used for this book was funded by the Hellenic Observatory at the LSE. So what is the book about? The book traces the implementation of the single most important reform of the public sector in Greece during the crisis. And this reform specifically relates to the removal of the country's tax collection institutions from direct ministerial control, in particular the control of the finance minister. Up until the beginning of this decade, the tax collection authority was an ordinary part of the central administration of the Greek state in Athens. And as a consequence of that, we had the big problem of political interference of all kinds in the operation of the tax collection institutions of the country. This ranged from turning a blind eye to tax collection issues regarding specific individuals, all the way to using party political affiliation for promotions, appointments to key posts, and so on and so forth. One of the things about Greece, one of the factors that led Greece to the big crisis that it faced towards the end of the previous decade was not so much the amount of money that the Greek state had been spending. It was primarily, to a very large extent I should say, very, very poor tax collection. It is not a hyperbole, a Greek word, to say that at least since the end of the war, there was no Greek government that was really serious about collecting taxes. And that was indicated by the state of the country's tax collection institutions at the end of the previous decade. Aging staff, people who were not motivated, they lacked the skills to a very large extent to collect tax effectively, and so on and so forth. As a result of this reform that was effectively imposed on the Greek political elite by the so-called Troika, in particular the IMF and the European Union, the tax collection authority of the country is no longer under the direct ministerial control of the Minister of Finance. It is, however, accountable to the country's parliament. So it's not out of control, at least in principle. This was the direct consequence of awareness on the part of the country's lenders, the institutions and the countries that had lent unprecedented amounts of money to the Greek state so as to ensure that it would avoid bankruptcy, that awareness of the fact that continuous political interference, and I'm using a term that they have been using in their own internal documents, was the root cause of the country's poor tax collection record. It is not a coincidence, I should say, that one senior official involved in this process said that because of the extent of the country's problems in terms of tax collection, the Troika had been spending probably the majority of its time trying, and I quote, to pull the country's tax collection institutions out of the 1930s. This allows me to highlight another feature of the book, which is the fact that part and parcel of the reform, the big reform, which is the depoliticization of the tax institutions of the country, is the introduction of rational techniques that are aimed at fostering better tax collection. For example, the use of evidence-based risk analysis that allows now the tax collection institutions of the country to focus some of their activities in areas, geographical areas, sectors, or groups of people who traditionally have a poor tax collection or tax compliance record. People like lawyers, medical doctors, architects, the liberal professions in general. Is this a perfect reform? No, not because it does not address a big issue, it does, and in my view, it is a reform that the country needed, given the total failure of the previous model. It is problematic though, because accountability, democratic accountability, is meant to be achieved under the new regime through the tax collection authorities' regular reporting to Greece's parliament, the directly elected representatives of the people. Now, the problem in this case is that Greek MPs, historically as well as now, are not used to evidence-based political accountability. They prefer historically sloganeering, being nice or being very vocal, not necessarily on the basis of evidence, whereas the actual new operation of the country's public revenue administration requires a totally different model of political oversight, democratic oversight. And this is something that only MPs themselves can foster and promote. Is it likely to be an enduring reform? I am on the skeptical side of the spectrum. Why? Because historically, the Greek political elite, the Greek political establishment, and this is not a comment that relates to a particular party, I'm referring to the political elite of the country as a whole, is very negative towards the operation of independent authorities like the newly established Independent Authority for Public Revenue. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not very optimistic about the actual survival of this institution in the medium term.